Welcome to another Yii3 video. I've created an example project utilizing Yii3's active record to interact with a Postgres database. The project has several pages allowing users to perform CRUD operations. In this video, I will show some of this project's web pages, walk through setting up the Postgres database, run migrations, explain how this project utilizes vertical slicing, data readers, forms, and active record, and walk through testing with Selenium and a database. This video is for educational purposes only. This project was made in a development environment with fake data and is not intended for production environments or real data. I'm not endorsing or recommending anything, just sharing my experience with the Yii3 web development framework. I hope it helps people get started more easily. This project has web pages that are built dynamically based on the URL parameters and database records. For example, if I go to the admin page and click Manage Person Records, then I see a table of person records that exist in the database. If I create a new person record, then that person record will be in that page's table. And there that new person is. If I edit that person's name, then this page reflects the change. And there is the update. There is a page to mark a person's chores done or undone, which will come up later when reviewing forms. So I'll show that page to provide some context. Here we have a list of chores, and I can check them off and uncheck them. So how do we set up a database for a Yii3 project? The Yii3 documentation website includes a helpful page for working with databases, which has a link to the official Postgres downloads page. Since I'm using a Windows machine, I installed Postgres version 18.3 with the Windows x86-64 installer. The installer will guide you through the installation process, and I will briefly explain some important steps. The installer asks which components you want to install. I installed Postgres Server, pgadmin4, Stack Builder, and command line tools. The installer asks for a password. This is the password for the Postgres user, which you can use to connect to the Postgres server to create databases. So you'll want to remember this password. The installer asks for a port. You'll want to remember this port because the Yii3 application uses it to connect to the database. I used the default 5432. At the end, the installer asks if you want to install anything with Stack Builder. I chose not to install anything with Stack Builder. Once installation is complete, you can start pgadmin4 and create the database. First, expand servers and enter the password that you created during installation. Next, right-click Databases, hover over Create, and click Database. This will open a form allowing you to create a database. I called my database Yii3 Admin. For this demo, I'll create another database called Yii3 Admin Demo. Now that we've seen how to create the database, let's see how to configure the Yii3 project to use the database. Using dependency injection, we configure the database connection, migration service, and connection provider. The database connection is configured in config, common, di, db-pgsql.php with values from config, common, params.php. We provide a data source name or DSN. which requires a driver, host, database name, which I will change to the one I just created, and port. And we also provide login credentials. Notice that I used the port and password from the Postgres installation and the name of the database that I created with pgadmin4. The connection provider is used by Yii3's migrations and is configured in config, common, bootstrap.php. It uses the database connection configuration that we just reviewed. The migration service is configured by the YiiSoft DB Migration Composer package using values that I've put in config, common, params.php. These values tell the migration service where to work with migrations when running commands. We can add tables to the database using migration files generated with the migrate create command. This project uses two tables, person and chore. Here you can see the migration files that were generated from these two create commands in the terminal. In both of the create commands, I provide a name argument and three options. The name argument is person for the person table and chore for the chore table. The first option specifies which command to execute. Since we're creating tables, I used the value table. The second option provides a table comment. The third option describes the fields that should be generated for the table. After running the create commands, migration files will be added in the src migration folder. You can see how the command argument and options populated the file with the name, comment, and fields, along with some other things like an index and a foreign key. With the packages used in this project, using UUID primary key results in migration files that have a duplicate ID primary key. This duplicate can be avoided by adding the primary key decorator to the ID field. Next, we can run the migrate up command to apply these migrations to the database. Then we can open pgadmin4 and see the empty tables in the database. Expand the database, then schemas, then tables, then right-click one of the tables, hover over View Edit Data, and click All Rows. And here's our empty chore table. And we can do the same with the other table, the person table, our empty person table. Next, we'll review the vertical slice architecture, which organizes code by feature. Ideally, it reduces coupling, increases cohesion, and facilitates independent development of features. A typical monolithic model view controller, or MVC project, might group code by technical purpose. Models go in the models folder, views go in the views folder, and controllers go in the controllers folder. With a vertical slice architecture, we might still use the MVC architecture within each feature, but the controller code for deleting a record, for example, would not be in the same file as the controller code for creating a record. This project's person chores feature is an example of the vertical slice architecture working with the MVC architecture. The model, view, and controller code is grouped together in src, web, person, chores, isolated from other model view and controller code, such as the chores admin feature. When we inspect the model code for those two features, we can see that both contain a chore model and that each chore model stores a distinct set of data about chores. In the person chores feature, The chore model stores the ID, name, and done status. In the chore admin feature, the chore model stores the ID, name, and person name. 2 fields are included in both models, and each model includes one of 2 other fields. These vertical slices allow each feature's model to be developed without affecting the other feature. While we're in the Person Chores feature vertical slice, let's see how it uses a data reader, form, and active record, starting from the action. First, the action takes an ID route argument. This route argument line is a PHP attribute that tells the framework to inject the route value named ID into this ID argument. We then use the Person Active Record class to find the associated person record. Active record is an object relational mapping, or ORM, pattern to facilitate interacting with a database. Yii's active record implementation includes convenient methods to find, create, update, and delete rows in a database. Because I used UUIDs instead of numeric IDs, errors would occur if I attempted to find a person with an ID that was not in the proper UUID format. So I made a trait that wraps the findByPK method in a method called findByUUIDPK. This centralizes the logic for finding an active record that has a UUID primary key. When used by the person class, this method will return a person record if found, or null if not found. If the person record is not found, then the action returns a not found response. If the person record is found, then the action renders a template, injecting the chore data reader. Data readers are another way of interacting with databases. In this case, it simplifies finding many rows and extracting specific pieces of information about each row. This data reader constructor accepts a person ID and a database connection. It then selects the ID, name, and done columns from the chore table, where person ID matches the person ID argument. The results are sorted by name and injected into instances of the person chores features chore model. The template then uses the data reader to display a grid view to the user. This grid uses a form to display a checkbox to the user. Forms facilitate building web forms and validating input. This form specifies a label for the checkbox and a validation rule that done should be the number 0 or 1. I chose to hide the label in the grid view since it seems obvious in the user interface. If the chore is done, then the checkbox will be checked. If the chore is not done, then the checkbox will be unchecked. In this script, I added event listeners to those checkboxes to update a chore's done status immediately after the user clicks a checkbox without requiring a page refresh. This JavaScript-driven approach presented an interesting situation for testing because the click handler was not testable using the Web Test Suite's PHP browser. Instead, I used an acceptance test suite with Selenium, which runs tests using a browser that runs JavaScript, allowing me to test the JavaScript handler. Before we can run the acceptance test suite, we need to configure the actor, which I've done in tests acceptance.suite.yaml. See how the acceptance actor uses Chrome, a browser that runs JavaScript, whereas the web actor uses PHP browser, which does not run JavaScript. Now that we have the actor configured, we can build it. First, set the app env to test, then run vendor bin codesept build. This step creates files such as acceptance tester that facilitate writing tests. Acceptance tester is used in the person chores page acceptance test, where we test the person chore checkbox toggling behavior. Notice that this test checks the database for the presence of certain records. The last step before being able to run tests is to set up the database. The acceptance test suite configuration includes a DB module that connects to the Postgres test database. This exact DB configuration is also used by the functional and web test suite configurations, since those test suites also use test database interactions. Clean up, populate, and dump ensure that the database state is reset to a known state. Dump specifies a SQL dump file to populate the database. Before creating a SQL dump file, I added records useful for testing to my dev database through the admin pages like the person admin page from the beginning of the video. Then I used pgadmin to create a backup. In pgadmin, right-click the dev database and select Backup. A dialog pops up, and I can fill it out and click this Backup button in the bottom right to get a SQL dump file ready for testing. I'll just do 3 things. First, select a file name. Next, select the plain format. Finally, click the Query Options tab and turn on the Use Insert Commands option. Then click Backup. Before leaving pgadmin, let's create the test database for the SQL dump file to populate. Just like before, right-click Databases, hover over Create, and click Database. I called my test database Yii3 admin test. Then click Save. The SQL file has 2 lines that cause testing to fail due to syntax errors, so I'll open up the file and remove those. The first line is at the beginning of the file, and it starts with \restrict. The second line is at the end of the file, and it starts with \unrestrict. And now that we have our test database configured, I'll go over one set of tests before demonstrating how to run the tests. Since this project has dynamic web pages, it made sense to use a data-driven approach for some of the tests. The Edit Person page test, for example, tests loading the page with various person IDs. I use this data provider attribute so that the load test runs for each of the entries in the array returned by load data, which provides 4 interesting person IDs. The first entry uses the person ID new to test loading the page to create a new person record. The second entry uses a valid UUID to test loading the page to edit an existing person record. The third entry uses a valid UUID that is not the ID of any person record in the database to test what happens when attempting to load a person that is not in the database. The fourth test uses a person ID that is neither a valid UUID nor the special new person ID to test what happens when an ID in an unexpected format is provided. Now that the app is built and testing is configured, we can install Selenium and run the tests. To install Selenium, run npx selenium standalone install. To run Selenium, run npx Selenium standalone start. To run the tests, set appenv to test and run vendor bin codesept run. And that's all. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it helped you understand the Yii3 web development framework better so that you can build Yii3 websites more easily and with greater confidence. If you have any questions about anything that was mentioned in this video or about anything that you find in this project's repository, please let me know in the comments.